Islam is a global and universalist religion that is the second largest and one of the fastest growing religions in the world. About 1/5 of the people on the planet are Muslims, probably about 1.3 billion or so. Islam began in the 7th century in Central Arabia. Prophet Muhammad revealed a whole series of revelations, supposedly dictated to him by the angel Gabriel, and a collection of these revelations are the Holy Quran, which are regarded by Muslims, is regarded by Muslims as the divine word, the word of God. Islam is an Abrahamic faith and a monotheistic religion. In fact, it's a very pure monotheistic religion in most of its forms, which is to say there's a complete distinction made between the divine realm, God, and all forms of creation. And there really aren't too many mediating factors, only the Quran, which is, being the divine word, a spark of the divine in the realm of creation. Islam is generally practiced mainly in countries in Asia and Africa, but there are Muslim communities all over the world, including increasingly in the West, the United States, Europe, Canada, etc., and growing Muslim populations all over the globe. Muslims and Islam is a very heterogeneous group. First of all, ethnically and in terms of nationality, they cover a very wide swathe of countries in almost any society, including even Japan. You can find Muslims. Secondly, Islam is a very heterogeneous religion in the sense that there's no orthodoxy. There are many different forms of Islam, many different versions of Islam. There is one dominant denomination, the Sunni Muslims, who constitute over 90% of the Muslims of the world. But even within that group, customs, practices, interpretations, and attitudes vary wildly. So you've got a very diverse sort of community here, a very diverse set of communities, a very diverse religious faith. And I would go so far as to say almost anything you can find among people in the world, you will find among the world's Muslims. To say of a group that constitutes 1/5 of all of humanity is anything special or discrete about them is silly. It's almost a synonym for human when you come to a group that big, because you're going to find everything in the human experience in it, both historically and today. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that non-Muslims and Muslims make in thinking about Islam and the Muslims of the world is to think in reductive terms, in essential terms, and to say, well, Muslims are like this and they're not like that, they believe this and they don't believe that, whereas in fact there's a huge heterogeneous, diverse set of Islamic beliefs, practices, and activities and behaviors. Now, Islamophobia is regarded as, I mean, literally speaking, it means fear of Islam, but I don't think that's properly what the term means or should mean. I think Islamophobia really is fear and hatred of Muslims. It's not about religion or religious ideas, it's about people. And really, in effect, it's about restricting the access and the power, empowerment, and the thriving and growth of Muslim communities in the West, is basically what it is. It has a great deal in common with anti-Semitism of the late 19th and 20th centuries. In other words, anti-Semitism was really a backlash against the growing Jewish presence and participation in European life and Western life after the emancipation of the Jews in the 18th and early 19th centuries. And anti-Semitism with a capital A and a capital S really was an attempt to push back against any kind of Jewish empowerment in Europe and in the West. And I think very similarly here, what you're seeing is a real pushback, an attempt to restrict the participation, the empowerment, the growth, the thriving of Muslim communities as well. I think the basic accusation, again, is much the same as it was in standard anti-Semitic discourse, that you know, there's a community of people who may look normal and may seem nice, but you need to know that they worship a hostile and alien God, that they are dangerous, that they are a threat to the sort of Western Christian way of life of the United States or the West, and their presence is an effort, a subversive effort to overthrow this society. That was basically the message that anti-Semitism was positing about Jews in the late 19th and through the middle of the 20th century, and even now on certain fringe discourses you get that. And this is the essential message of Islamophobia. It's fear and hatred of the presence of Muslims in Western societies. Now, obviously, the anti-Semitic discourse is fueled by some real factors. There is an unfortunately robust extremist minority, very small but very passionate in the world, among the world's Muslims. And Islamophobes who want to spread fear and hatred latch on to this minority and present them as typical or the vanguard or the real representatives of the world's Muslims. And it's interesting that the extremists and the Islamophobes tend to agree a lot on their interpretation of the religion. In other words, they both interpret it in the most extreme and sometimes violent senses, whereas most of the Muslims of the world don't share that interpretation. That's a very interesting phenomenon. Really, there's been a rise since 9/11 in the United States of a kind of Islamophobic discourse, a narrative. And what's really interesting, I think, is that there's more there's more of an element of Islamophobia in the culture and political discourse in the United States in 2010 than there was in 2002 and 2003, in the years immediately following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And the reason I think this is significant is that if it were simply a reaction to a violent atrocity such as the 9/11 attacks, then I think you would have predicted that Islamophobia would have been at its peak in the immediate aftermath. Instead, it seems like it's starting to peak almost 10 years later. Why is that? I think it's because this isn't about a reaction to events. Events don't dictate culture. Events have to be interpreted through narratives. And it's this narrative that has coalesced in the last 10 years. It's found its shape, it's refined itself, it has become much more coherent, and it has started to insert itself into deeper parts of the cultural and political life of our country through repetition. Repetition is extremely important. This narrative it existed in 2001 and 2002, but it was very inchoate. It wasn't well formed. It was very sort of very ad hoc and crude. And I think over the past 10 years it's been greatly refined. It's been shaped into a familiar narrative that has a diagnosis and a prescription. The diagnosis is the Muslims are dangerous for X, Y, and Z complicated reasons. The prescription is restrict their rights, place them under surveillance, curtail their immigration, or something like that, but impede their religious or practices and be very, very, very wary of them at all times and in all ways. That's the prescription. And it's become a recognizable, understood and accepted part of American discourse. That doesn't mean that we have an Islamophobic culture or an Islamophobic society. We don't. Most Americans have not embraced this form of bigotry at all. And the government certainly has fought back against it in many instances. And I think a lot of responsible leaders have been very good on this subject. Certainly the FBI and law enforcement have not put up with hate crimes, and they've enforced hate crime legislation when it comes to Arabs and Muslims in the United States very vigorously, and they deserve credit for that. What I mean is that it has become part of our cultural and political discourse in a way that it hasn't been before, and it's getting worse. The numbers, poll numbers, reflecting fear and suspicion of Muslims are way up from 2002, where the numbers were fairly low, and Islam was regarded in the same way by most Americans, in numbers similar to the way they look at Catholicism, which is the biggest single Christian denomination in the United States. By 2006, you were seeing very alarming numbers about people engaging in fear and hatred of Islam and embracing that and welcoming the idea of restrictions on Muslim rights and activities and whatnot. And more recently, you've seen numbers that are even higher. So even though we haven't had any repetition of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and we really don't have a major problem with Muslim terrorism inside the United States, And around the world, Muslim societies are fighting back against the extremists. All mainstream Muslim societies are fighting against the extremists, and governments are completely arrayed against groups like Al-Qaeda unanimously. Nonetheless, because of this narrative, the situation seems to be getting worse, independent of events. And that's what I think is so interesting about bigotry, and it's one reason why I don't like the word Islamophobia very much, and I probably would have chosen a different one. It's problematic in the same way anti-Semitism is a problematic term, but it's the term we have, and these are phenomena that need to be described. If we all understand what we mean, it's fine. But there is something in the term Islamophobia that I do like, which is the phobic part. I do think there's an element of irrational fear attached to this, and there is an element of real phobia involved at times. And the problem is there are a lot of other things involved as well, so I think it's just too limited. But phobia, by definition, isn't rational, and it's not linked to a real danger or a real threat or a real intensification of threat. It's a neurotic affect that is independent of the reality, of the measurable, testable, knowable reality. So that if you're in a phobic mood, it doesn't matter what evidence you're presented with. In other words, if someone were to say, well, the Muslims are very dangerous, and another person would say, well, but I know this nice Muslim family down the street, the answer would be, aha, you see how clever they are. They've even convinced you. You know, evidence to the contrary in a paranoid mind becomes confirmation again, and that's what we're dealing with here. It certainly was true of anti-Semitic paranoia, and I think it's very much true of Islamophobic paranoia as well.
Dr. Hussein Ibish, thank you so much for joining us today from Washington, D.C.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.